we're starting on our acrylic techniques today, and I want you to measure 1/4 inch on the sides, and then you're going to do 1/2 inch on the top and bottom.
We're going to go ahead and we're going to mark 2.5 inches. So we know that 2.5 plus 2.5 is 5. So we're going to mark on 2.5, then we're going to mark on 5, and then we can measure the rest, but we know that it's about 2.5. Okay, so we're going to do that again at the bottom. So 2.5, 5, and then we know that it's about 2.5 on the end. And then I use my straight edge again, which is just an old demo that I did for this same lesson. So that we have all of our vertical lines done. Now, there we go. There's all of our vertical lines. Now, all right, now we have, we're gonna try to make ours 9 inches so it's an easier number. So we're gonna go ahead and use our half an inch measure mark, excuse me. Okay, and then we're gonna do it on both sides just like we always do so that the lines turn out straight. And then I use my straight edge to connect the two. So we're just doing 1/2 inch on the top. So the sides were 1/4 inch. The top and bottom are going to be 1/2 inch, which is twice the width of the sides. So 1/2 inch on the top and bottom. And then we're gonna draw all of our horizontal lines. Perfect. Okay, so we know that we have 9 inches because we just talked about it. So then we're gonna go 3, 6. So we're measuring just the left side, and then we know that the bottom line that we already drew is 9. So then we're gonna go 3, 6, then we know that the bottom part is 9. So now, oops, I got my finger in there. All right, perfect. So there you have it. That's what you should have. And then you will go ahead and label each of these cells. I'm gonna leave this one up so you can see our first 3 is what we're gonna start with today. So we've got glazing, alla prima, and impasto. So make sure that you write those at the bottom before you start painting. So we've got glazing, alla prima, ALLAPRIMA, impasto.
A severe weather alert has been issued. Please seek shelter and stay indoors.
All right, now once you have all of them labeled, then you can go ahead and you see the stars. You don't need to write the stars on here, but you can make some kind of indication or mark. So I might do a dash behind all the ones with stars. So glazing from the top row, sgraffito, sponge, stencil needs a dash, and scumbling. So it's whatever mark will help you remind you that you have a layer that you have to paint first. So when you have a layer that you have to paint first, that you get that done, and I'll talk to you about it. So we'll just do it row by row. So for glazing, I'm gonna come up with some kind of subject matter that would look nice with another layer on top of it. So just about anything you can do for glazing. For this example, am going to do one that is just a grid of colors and how the colors interact with each other. So for glazing, you're using that white cup that is not white paint. So mine is this one on the very end should be your glazing. So your white paint is thicker and it's the one that you've been using. Your glazing medium is matte medium or gloss medium, and it's gonna be in the end cup. So for these examples of glazing, I painted the spheres on this surface, and then I added the shadows, glazing them in. For this example, I did one apple. I glazed the red on top of it to make it brighter red because it was an orange apple, and then I glazed the shadow underneath. So whatever you choose to do for your subject matter, it should be easily identifiable for me. I am going to use maybe a medium-sized brush. So this one's a medium-sized brush. And I'm going to use my 3 primary colors. and I am going to see how they overlap with one another. So I'm going to do these ones straight on. So when I switch colors, so for the most part, I try to just use my palette. And I can use the end of my brush if I know that I'm going to need more red than this. But I'm really not going to need much more red than this because of the nature of it being glazing. So I'm going to do one line of red this way, and I'm going to carry mine all the way down. And you can use tape if you want to, if you're in school, if you're at home, use whatever you have. If you want to try to make a straight edge, you don't have to though. See, I'm just doing mine kind of willy-nilly, but I'm trying to control it the best I can. So there we go, there's one line. I clean my brush or whatever I'm dipping into so that my paints on my mat board or chipboard stay completely pure. So when you start mixing colors, your colors are not pure anymore. And then if you needed white and you got a green because you dipped or you needed yellow and you got kind of a green because you dipped your paintbrush into there after touching blue, then that's just on you. We talked about that in the last video, that you guys have got to make sure that your paints are staying clean. All right, now I'm going in with the yellow right beside. I'm just making these stripes all the way down. I'm gonna clean off my brush, and I'm gonna get some blue out. I'm gonna trade these two spots. Hopefully you have yours labeled by now. And I'm gonna come over here and get some blue out, making sure that my brush is clean before I dip it in. And then I'm going to go ahead and try to create a smooth line coming down. All right, so that's my base. So I've got to let that dry before I move on to the next layers. These two are also ones that you don't need a background for, right? Because they don't have the dash behind them, so that you know that there's only, that there's not a layer that has to be dry first. Glazing, if you were to go in and glaze on top of this, it would turn all spotty and muddy and you wouldn't like what you have. You wouldn't like the end result. So alla prima is wet on wet is what that means. And so we are mixing on the palette. So if I wanted to make some kind of gradient, I could. Sometimes I just like to do some kind of swirl. And it can be, you can use thick paint or you can use thin paint. It's just gotta be wet, right? So I'm mixing wet paint into other wet paint. So you can see that my yellow, because I mixed a little bit because when I touched the blue right beside it. So maybe I make bullseyes, which the next color could mix a little bit. So you're mixing on the palette alla prima, wet on wet. So try that out, try to give yourself some space to mix it. And then I'm gonna do another layer in front that's gonna be darker, red, orange kind of color. And you could even try to mix colors that you wouldn't normally. So if I do orange and blue, what do you think I'm gonna get? Orange and blue are opposites. So you get something pretty neutral. I can use water to keep it going and keep it wet. So it's just wet on wet painting. So we're just practicing different acrylic painting techniques. So there's some pretty colors. There we go. And you'll maybe kind of have to work, sorry about the bell. You'll maybe kind of have to work a little bit to get it wet. So to keep it wet, you'll have to keep working kind of quickly because acrylic paint dries pretty fast. All right. That's my wet on wet smooth transition. Now we're gonna move on to impasto. And impasto is a thicker application of paint than you're probably comfortable with doing, but we're gonna take the plunge. So impasto you could use with a palette knife. I can do impasto with the end of my brush. I can do impasto with the paintbrush. What's pretty cool is these kinds of brushes, the hard hair brushes, they're meant for making texture in your paint. That's why that's there. So when you add a big glob of paint, that they'll have texture showing in your surface. So if I want to go in, and I'm gonna use a lot of paint with this one. So I'm gonna go in and put a bunch of my paint onto my palette. And then whatever I have left on my palette knife, I can scrape onto here. And it kind of depends on what you're wanting to make, but I kind of just want you to explore with it. See what you would want to make, okay? So we swish off our brush. Sometimes it helps when you're cleaning your palette knife. So let's put this over here so you can see that you can brush off with your paintbrush all the paint off of your palette knife. That's pretty helpful. That way you don't get it all over your rag so much as you go. So I'm gonna use some blue and try to mix these colors a little bit. I'm just gonna see what it turns into and make it into that. And I can use my paintbrush to clean off my palette knife. Perfect. Or the end of your paintbrush if you're using the end of your paintbrush. Or I can use my paintbrush itself. But remember, it's a thick application of paint and you're not trying to blend it in. So it should have a texture. So maybe I go like this. And I can move it around a little bit. Some of these ones in the past, I did some flowers, which flowers are pretty fun to do with this. Not saying that you have to do that by any means. So I'm just mixing colors right now to try to make kind of a green color. For my flowers to be laying in. And then maybe I want to do some white with my blue. So if I'm mixing any colors, if I'm not using the primary colors, I'm mixing them on my palette. Because it's impasto, it's thick application.
Mr. Elvis's room is?
Hold on, let me pause. All right, and then we're going in and adding some more flowers. So it can be kind of abstract. The point is that you know that it's a thick application of paint. I almost forgot, we have to go back to our glazing. Okay, so I did the red, yellow, and blue, and they were pretty pure colors. Now I'm gonna use my glazing medium, which is matte medium, and I'm going to mix, make sure that your brush is clean, because I just wanna see the effects of glazing. So I'm just gonna mix So see, that's a pure red, nothing in my brush. Same with this, that you can kind of pour it out, or you can scoop some out with your palette knife and put it on there, right? And then I might put some on my yellow and my blue, because I know that I'm gonna need those. Swish off your palette knife, because the next thing you do, you don't wanna have a dirty palette knife for. All right, so we're gonna go in, and you can see how the colors kind of interact. Does it make a perfect purple? Not really, but maybe that's because this is a really, really warm red. So some reds are a little bit cooler, and I think that those reds are the ones that make the best purples. So that's why a lot of the time artists will use multiple of one color. So normally in a non-COVID year, you guys would have the option of cadmium red or alizarin crimson red. The reds that you guys have are cadmium red. So I'm trying to just thin out my yellow and make it as pure as possible so that you can see through it is the point. Oh, mine wasn't totally completely dry. Oops. Oops, because that middle one's supposed to be perfectly yellow. Uh-oh. So because the bottom layer should be somewhat dry, you can kind of wipe it off, okay? All right, there we go. I'm just bringing back my yellow. Okay, so your glazing is just a thin layer on top of, but anytime you glaze, you want it to be completely dry underneath. Not even following my own rule here. Okay, and then we're going underneath. And when I'm glazing, I really stress to myself just a thin application. So if I want to use the back of my palette knife to get some glazing medium out, there we go. That's a lot thinner. And then you can do layers if it needs more, but you can't really take away. All right, so there you have the glazing category. All right, now you can move on to the next. We're gonna move on to the next. Unless you've been instructed to stop, then you can go ahead and stop with those three. If you have been instructed to go on, then you can go on. Now remember the dashes on the bottom that you want to make sure that you're doing those ones first. So with Scrispito, the bottom layer has to be completely dry. And I'm gonna try to make mine kind of dark. It doesn't need to be the exact same color all over. That I just want to have some contrast. So either go really dark or really light, or make some kind of really bright color, because we're gonna want the bottom layer to show through. All right, so we're gonna move on, let that one dry. The flat wash is probably the easiest one out of all of these, but you're just trying to make the most consistent and thin down, so you're just using water for the most part. So you're trying to create a thin, so I might even paint mine wet first. So paint it with water first. And you can see it's picking up some of the graphite from the edges, that's okay. All right, and then on top of this, we're gonna go and we're gonna try to mix an interesting color and paint it consistently. Consistency is the key, and thin. So thin and consistent. So we're gonna go on here and it's just a wash of color. So if it's too thick on this edge, I might go this direction. All right, and then that one's, once you feel like it's as consistent as it can be, then you can be pretty done. That's a wash of color. All right, and then palette knife painting. So this is just like impasto, except you're only using a palette knife. Now, if you're at home and you don't have a palette knife, because we just have a community supply of palette knives, that just wasn't in our budget this year to get everyone palette knives. So you can use the back of your paintbrush, or you can use a library card or credit card, because these are gonna be more geometric if you use a palette knife. And then they'll be more geometric if you do use a palette knife. So I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna start mapping in kind of a sky. Kind of looks like it might be a night sky. So just anything that would have a hard geometric edge. So a credit card works, your library cards, any of those fake cards that you get in the mail. Even if you wanted to cut them a little bit, you could. Old gift cards work. Just make sure that even though you're using a palette knife, you clean it between each stage so that you're not dipping big colors into, like your white you don't want to be mixed, or because this one uses more paint, that I probably won't have you guys use just your palettes, that you're using the cups as well. So I'm trying to make kind of a light sky. And then I can add some clouds into it later. So you see how it's more of an experimental. It's not gonna be completely blended, right? So I can add some clouds even. Right? Cleaning off your brush every time. And then maybe I want to make some buildings in this. So I don't necessarily have to wait for it to dry. So I'm thinking I'm gonna try to mix kind of a gray color out of what I have here. So I need some yellow for sure. And some red and some blue. So I can mix. I'm gonna go in and mix. I've got my mixed gray here, which is kind of just a wild gray. It's not completely mixed all the way through. And I'm gonna try my best to make some like little skyscrapers. Or at least for me, I know that that's what they are. And then later, if I wanted to, once everything's solidified, I can make them a little bit darker, could add some windows. Okay, so I might make the windows just in blue. So just have fun with it. So there's my skyscraper. Now, if you have been instructed to stop after the second row of 3 and you did your sgraffito, flat wash, and palette knife, make sure that you're not moving on, okay? So your sgraffito is our last one, and we just have one layer to do. I'm gonna do a a bright yellow over the top. So I might even mix in some white. So I'm gonna make sure that I'm using a clean side of my brush, or in my case, the handle of it. So I'm not mixing these, and I'm just gonna paint over the top of all that hard work I did to cover this.
So you're just painting over the top of all of this, and you're wanting to work pretty quickly. For this graffito area, it's about using a tool, so it could be a pencil. Usually I use the back of my brush. So once the whole area is covered, I'm working quickly to come up with a design that I'm just going to mark with the back of my brush into the actual surface, and you can see that it shows up whatever color is underneath. So you really need to make sure that the bottom layer is completely dry. So here I am, I'm just spelling out purple because that's the color that's underneath, and then I start connecting, making faces. See there's a nose and an eye, and it's just kind of loose, and I'm just trying to have fun with it. You can be a little bit more controlled with this. I'm just making a contour line drawing face that's pretty abstract. And I'm going over some of it so that it has thicker lines in some areas and thinner lines in other areas. All right, so now that one's done.
Once you guys have finished the second row of 3, and if you have been instructed to move on, you may. But if you were instructed to stop after your second row of 3, after this graffito, flat wash, and palette knife, then you can move on or stop, whatever. Make sure that you're doing what your teacher asked.
Be sure to rinse out your sponge when you're done using it. I like to rinse mine in my water cup, and then I take it to the sink with my brushes and everything. This is so that it doesn't get hard and the paint doesn't dry in there permanently. For this next one, stencil, I like to use a medium-sized brush or a large brush even, and I'm just finding things, already objects that I know will make a cool stencil. So this is a magazine clipping of a succulent. It kind of looks like a star shape, and so I'm just going to lay that one down flat, and I'm just going to stencil some paint on using a dry brushing technique around it. So I'm just dabbing it really lightly. I'm not squishing the brush or pushing really hard. I am just dabbing around it, and then I could use my fingernails or a palette knife, or I could use anything that's got like a sharp kind of edge to kind of peel it off. So it can be like a library card, or it could be like a car key or something to peel it up off. And so it left a little stencil mark. I could also use a piece of paper or like a business card size piece of paper and do the opposite. So the positive space is left out. So the area of the fork, the plastic fork that I'm using, are the parts that are showing through from the underneath. So I could do the opposite and make the foreground. So I could use something that would just blot the inside. So like a traditional stencil that you would use for lettering, how you use markers when you're a kid, that you probably did lots of stencil stuff. So the same concept. This one I'm going to try to do something light around it. It's a fake flower that I peeled off. Oh, here's an example of a stencil. I did the positive space. So this one I'm just doing some light yellow around it. Maybe I'll mix some white with it. Nope, just straight yellow. All right, here we go. And then I'm blotting around it. It's kind of hard to see, but it is a nice color change, and there is a nice overlapping of the two shapes. So it makes it look more like a little starburst. Awesome. And then you decide when you want to stop with this one. So I could keep going and keep adding other layers on this one if I'd like to. But I think for that one's good. The last one, the scumbling one, I just blended a landscape in there with, I mixed my own green with a tiny, tiny bit of red to make it more of a rich color for the ground. And then the sky, I added a little bit of white to some of the blue and made a little gradient. That's all. And then let that dry first. So each one of these bottom row all had a dash beside them, meaning that they needed to be adjusted a little bit. So this sky one, I'm gonna add some clouds, and that's what I'm doing scumbling with. So make sure before you start scumbling, everything is completely dry. This one was not quite dry, and it can make things look a little bit patchy or accidental. It doesn't look as finished as it would if it wasn't. So this one has been sped up just a smidge, and I am doing some little rotations or circles with my brush, doing kind of circular shapes, and I'm trying to make the clouds that are closest to me or in the top of the sky bigger, and the ones closer to the horizon a lot smaller. And my brush wasn't totally clean with this, so I'm not super happy with it, but it just shows the importance of making sure that your brush is really, really clean. And I'm layering on the white. So usually I try to do some layers of pink and yellow, just very, very subtle. And you wanna make sure that your brush is completely dry. So I dry off my brush several times in this video. I also blotted off the extra paint on my hand, just because that's something that I always do out of habit. Obviously you don't need to paint on yourself, you have a palette. So here's some of the smaller ones that are a little bit softer, closer to the horizon. Anything soft and fluffy for this one. So you could even do like a rabbit with a little cotton tail. You could do just anything blurry even is good for scumbling. So the background of your guys's still lifes were a good practice for this, but also you might use scumbling for soft rosy cheeks on a portrait. I like to use scumbling, especially for things that are far away. So just like when you take pictures in portrait mode on your iPhone, it makes the background blurry. You kind of think, well, if I want my painting to look realistic or like professional, that it's good to show that depth of field that good photography shows. So how the background or things that aren't in view or aren't the focus can be a little bit blurrier. Here I'm probably gonna dip into a little bit of yellow soon for the main light of the clouds. So I could keep going on this and making layers fluffier and fluffier. Let me know if you guys have questions. Thank you for watching.